Dr. Lee?
Thank you, Marie Chantal. Anyway, I thought I would give a talk today about a program that we have in DFO and what we're doing in terms of pollution remediation to give you some guidance on how we put together our program and how you can benefit from our lessons learned. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so what we wanted to talk about was the blue economy and technology developments in ocean pollution remediation. And I'll go quickly through this file. I have a few more slides than I thought for the time given. We all know what the blue economy is and the importance to Canada. It supports over 300,000 jobs and $31 billion in GDP annually. And of course, Canada has a great opportunity to benefit from the blue economy, having 3 oceans and the longest coastline in the world. And within our national blue economy strategy, we aim to protect 25% of our oceans by 2020. Unfortunately, at the same time, experts warn us that human activities linked to population and industrial growth, things like climate change, intensification of agriculture, as Marie Chantal mentioned, important to DFO, overfishing, things like marine noise, and of course there's increases in pollution. And this is really endangering our oceans assets and reliance ecosystems. If we look at the things that we mentioned already, oceanicity is expected to increase 170% by 2100 if present CO2 emissions continue. There's a 3-fold increase in nitrogen and phosphorus enrichment in the oceans. And as a result of that, now we're seeing a number of dead zones in our oceans, for instance, in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Marine debris threatens the integrity of our marine food chains. And right now, more than 220 million tons of plastics are produced each year. And it's predicted that the amount of plastic will outweigh fish by the year 2050 if we keep up with this trend. And of course, with increases in marine shipping, especially in the Canadian Arctic, and then things like offshore exploration of petroleum hydrocarbons, and in the future, perhaps mineral exploration, other sea-based sources of pollution are expected to increase. So when we're looking at the blue economy, as our minister mentioned and as Marie Chantal mentioned, we really must tap into the latest innovations and scientific advances and best practices to maintain prosperity and conserve our ecosystem for future generations. So when we're thinking of putting together a research program for the blue economy in terms of remediation, there are a number of things that I thought you should consider. One is, what are the current and emerging challenges? And I think Marie Chantal already mentioned the 4 that NRC is looking at. The other is, what's the most significant benefit to be made from the advances in remediation technologies? So which one do we tackle to make the best bang for the dollar? And then, of course, there's a question of who's going to adopt this technology if we develop it. We can come up with some phenomenal oil spill cleanup techniques, but if industry isn't willing to pick it up or use it, it's really meaningless. And then, of course, the next thing we have to look at is, do we have the core expertise to build a program to tackle the issues we want? Or do we need to develop new expertise within Canada? And looking at that, what we did within DFO is said, well, if we don't have it within our department or within Canada, what research collaborations and partnerships are required nationally as well as internationally to tackle these issues? And then if we get together on this, we're really looking at global issues. Are there primary clients and stakeholders that are willing to invest? And how do we leverage funds? And then, as I mentioned, how do we ensure that these technologies that we develop will be used? So one of the big things in all of our research is really looking at technology transfer and utilization so we have impact at the end of the program and beyond the program. And then, of course, one of the questions that was just raised was, can the project goals be achieved within 10 years? Are we tackling something that we can actually do? Is it feasible? It was mentioned that plastic pollution is one of the major concerns right now. As we noted, it's still growing It's estimated that 1.1 to 2.41 million tons of plastic entering the ocean each year from our rivers. We know that the plastic in the oceans gathers in gyres around several places around the world. And of course, microplastics, which is a breakdown of these large plastic particles, is a major issue. And in terms of DFO or looking at fisheries, it's because animals confuse them for food and it causes malnutrition. There are a number of red listed species in the IUCN listing that are now impacted by plastics. And remediation is a challenge for cleanup by conventional means. So if we think that we can go to these ocean gyres and physically recover plastics with nets and towed by boats, it really isn't feasible. It can't be done. It just takes too much effort. It would take hundreds of years and it would be cost prohibitive. So therefore, we have to come up with some new ideas for technologies that are perhaps autonomous or energy neutral passive systems. Now, moving on to remediation, to give you an example of what we did within DFO, one of the things that we tackled was really oil spills. What can we do about petroleum that's released in the marine environment? The amount of oil spills in the media, you think about large tanker spills, but in reality, the number of tanker spills has decreased over the years. The challenges right now are spills from increases in marine traffic, including the Canadian Arctic. As we know, with climate change, the Northwest Passage is open for longer periods of time. And there's also expansion of industrial activities and urban growth in the Arctic, which requires the movement of fuel and resources up to the Arctic. Then, of course, we have exploration and production of offshore oil and gas. Over the past few years, as you've seen in the media, we've had a number of spills off the coast of Newfoundland, for example. And then there's concern over pipelines and rail transport and things like transshipment terminals with diluted bitumen, as we all know, on the West Coast. So in Fisheries and Oceans Canada, in terms of oil spill remediation, we actually benefited from Canada's Ocean Protection Plan. And one of the 50 projects under OPP was a multi-partner research initiative that I lead for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Now, this group that we put together, this research initiative, is funding industry, academia, and other government agencies. None of the money that we use actually funds researchers within the Canadian government system. There are other funds for that to also do oil spill research. But what we want to do is, why are we tackling an issue that's global? So let's put together an integrated global research network to advance oil spill research in Canada. And we aligned it with priorities, primarily in terms of research, from the Royal Society of Canada report in 2015 on the behavior and environmental impacts of crude oil released in the aqueous environments that I had the honor of co-chairing. And then in this report, we identified and recommended over 400 areas for research to tackle oil spills. So the focus was to advance scientific knowledge and science-based decision-making to respond to oil spills, to improve our knowledge. One of the things that we found was when oil spills occur, we get together and make decisions, there's data missing. We're scrambling all over the place to find data to make science-based decisions. So how do we get people to work together and to advance the remediation strategies? So one of the things that we focused on was, how do we expand our toolbox for oil spill response? What technologies can we bring forward to advance what we're using right now? The other thing that we wanted to do, as I mentioned, is we don't have the expertise, can we develop it? So one of the things that we focus on in the MPRI research program was actually training highly qualified personnel in industry and postgraduate students and postdoctoral fellows in academia. And as I mentioned, oil spills are of global concern. How do we find partners and collaborators that are willing to leverage their funds, what we have, to put together this program? And we also want to engage all the clients and stakeholders that we can find, including indigenous groups, the oil and gas industry, oil spill response organizations, fisheries groups, and others. As I mentioned, the Royal Society of Canada report came out with over 400 recommendations for research. That would be impossible to try and answer every one of those scientific recommendations. So what we decided was, well, let's focus on what we really want to do. And that's to focus on spill remediation procedures or techniques. Now, the Canadian Coast Guard has identified a number of response measures, which they called alternative response measures. These are techniques that are used in other countries in some cases with success, but unfortunately, they can't be used in Canada due to a number of regulations and policies. For instance, under the Fisheries Act, you can't put deleterious substances in the marine environment. So therefore, if you add chemicals to the environment to clean up oil spills, it's illegal because you're adding deleterious substances to the marine environment. So there are 4 alternative response measures which legally the oil spill responders cannot use in Canada easily. One is oil spill treating agents. The second is in situ burning, oil translocation, understanding how oil moves from one part of the environment to the other, decanting, oil water separation techniques, and oily waste disposal. And then another thing that I wanted to add on top was natural attenuation. There are many cases where we just can't do anything due to logistical challenges such as weather. And sometimes it's best to let nature clean up an oil spill on its own. So you have to have a better understanding of natural attenuation. Also, can we speed up natural degradation of oil by looking at things like bioremediation? And then they're looking at those other 400 items or other things that we call cross-cutting technologies. These are things that support or cross over with all of the above. So for instance, if you're going to clean up oil spills, you want to know where they are. So we need to improve the monitoring techniques for monitoring where the oil is in the environment. Or any technology that we use, there's concern about toxicity of that technology. So we have to do toxic assays. So the MPRI program, under MPRI, we put out $45.5 million in funding. We're now working with 60 institutions around the world in 12 countries, currently supporting 220 researchers that include 24 PDFs and 43 postgraduate students. Oil spill treating agents or any chemical products that we can add that change behavior of oil spills to facilitate response and cleanup. And of course, one of the big ones is the use of chemical oil dispersants. And it really comes down to encounter rate. You can only encounter, you can't encounter something you can't clean it up. And that's the challenge with plastics. So if you look at that figure with the ship going through the oil slick, that's a ship going through the oil slick in the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. If that ship was towing a boom to collect the oil, it might make 1 or 2 passes a day. Whereas if you apply chemical oil dispersants of an aircraft, you can cover that whole slick in a matter of hours. Oh, I got a glitch here. Okay, so spill treating agents, there are a number of things that we're doing. We're developing new products. One of the things that we're looking at is the development of biosurfactants. So trying to develop dispersants that are produced by natural microbes. And as I mentioned, we want to know where the oil is. Another program is looking at the development of autonomous underwater vehicles. And one of the things that they're looking at there is artificial intelligence, so we can have a vehicle that can actually go searching for an oil spill and map it. Oil spill treating agents, one of the things that we have to understand is the behavior of oil in the environment, understanding plume behavior and oil droplet behavior. Because when you use chemical dispersants, you generate oil droplets. The smaller droplets, the more effective. How do we understand droplet behavior and model it? The other thing that we're looking at are things like chemical herders. These are chemicals or surfactants that you can add around an oil slick to actually thicken up the slick and reduce the area it covers. And this, of course, can enhance the recovery physically of the oil on water or thicken up the oil enough that we can burn it. Chemical oil dispersants don't work unless there's mixing energy. So if you have calm seas, even if you add chemical oil dispersants, they don't work well. So we have to understand how much energy is required for chemical oil dispersants to work. And one of the things that we're looking at is, can we add that mixing energy either by prop wash or developing technologies to create that turbulence in the ocean when chemical oil dispersants are used. One of the things that we're looking at right now, we're requesting permits to actually conduct experiments at sea where we intend to spill dispersants in the ocean, open ocean, to test a number of technologies at an operational scale. It's impossible to make full studies in chemical oil dispersants in a flask or mesocosm facilities such as wave tanks due to the interaction of the oil and waves with the walls. So you have all these wall effects. In situ burning oil at sea is something that Environment Canada demonstrated a number of years ago, and it was used effectively for the first time in the Gulf of Mexico with success. And so one of the things that we are looking at there is understanding what's the window of opportunity, when can we use in situ burning? And one of the problems with in situ burning are the atmospheric emissions and also the burn residues. So we need a better understanding of the ecological effects of in situ burning. The other thing that we're looking at is testing in situ burning at sea. We're asking for permits, and we're looking at testing 3 new technologies. A new boom technology where you don't have to use a fire resistant boom. You can't burn oil unless you get it thick enough to ignite. And that requires fire resistant booms, which are very heavy and expensive. So we're looking at new boom technologies where we can use conventional boom and actually ignite the oil after it leaves the boom. The other thing is flame refluxers to increase the efficiency of burning. And then one of the other projects is the use of remotely operated surface vehicles to apply chemical herders around the slick to thicken it without the use of booms, and also use this device to actually ignite the oil. And we're looking at a device that we can drop from aircraft. And then of course, with these field studies, there's a number of monitoring technologies that we're developing to look at atmospheric inputs as well as burn residues at sea. So we're looking at remotely operated underwater vehicles as well as airborne vehicles to monitor smoke emissions. Oil translocation, understanding the processes that move oil from one area in the environment to another. And how do we, by having a better understanding of this, can we enhance the technologies of oil and particle interactions for cleanup technologies? So we're looking at things like the effect of nanocellulose particles to actually mobilize the oil for cleanup in stranded oil stranded beaches, for instance. And we're developing models from our understanding of the different types of sediments around Canada, putting it in a database and trying to make predictive models where we can look at what are the various scenarios that we can use to clean up oil spills and what are the impacts. Legally, the only method that we can use in Canada to clean up oil spills is really physical recovery, where we go out and boom and skim oil. So we capture oil in a boom and we use chemical apparatus called a skimmer to actually collect that oil to bring back to shore. Unfortunately, skimmers also bring back not only the oil that they recover, but a large volume of water with it. And so we waste a lot of resources moving ships, bringing oil and water mixtures back to shore. So it'd be a really great advantage if we came up with some decanting technologies. We could separate the water from the oil at sea so we can dispose of water fraction and continue on with the decanting operations. So there are a number of technologies that we're working on there, nano and microbubble gas flotation technologies. At Memorial University in Newfoundland, looking at hydrophilic meshes and activated carbon filters. The University of Toronto is working on surface engineered sponge absorbents for secondary treatment. And then at CSRO in Australia, they're working on porous polymers and de-emulsifying agents for oil spill wastewater cleanup. As I mentioned, natural attenuation is very important. The scientific consensus of what happened to most of the oil that was spilled in the Gulf of Mexico, it was degraded by microbes. We have a large program in natural attenuation, actually led by Dr. Charles Greer at NRC, as well as with Lyle White at McGill University in Montreal. And in these programs, we're looking at baseline monitoring of hydrocarbons and contaminants with microbial genomics in the Arctic, for instance, in water, as well as oil biodegradation in Arctic beach environments, where we're looking at potential spills of fuel oils in the Arctic. And they're looking at bioremediation technologies. They're also developing in situ methods of sampling and monitoring hydrocarbons and microbial activity in the ocean. And this work complements the NRC Canada's Ocean Cluster program on eDNA. And CSRO is developing an in situ apparatus for doing genomics analysis. And Charles has worked on these microbial in situ samplers for looking at the microbial degradation capacity in the oceans. And this includes both the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Ocean in Canada. Oil detection and characterization. One of the things that the International Maritime Organization and MARPOL has brought in the future, we're looking at new low sulfur fuels that the marine and shipping industry must use. So we have to understand and characterize these fuels and how they interact with different oil spill response options. And this is work that we're doing in Canada with industry. For instance, SL Ross in Ottawa, in collaboration with SINTEF in Norway. We're also developing risk assessment models to look at the Arctic, and then a project with NOAA in the US to look at new technologies that we can use to monitor oil spill thickness remotely. As I mentioned, one of the questions regarding oil remediation or any type of remediation technique we're going to pick up is, how clean is clean? When do you know to stop? So we're looking at toxicity as an endpoint, and there's a lot of work on developing assays using Canadian species of concern, so we can understand what are the potential impacts on Canadian species that we're worried about. And we're testing them against crude oil and fuel oil mixtures, dispersants, and chemical herders. Taking that one step further, how do we put that toxicity data together? We bring them together with physical oceanographers. And one of the things that we're looking at is developing whole of ecosystem models to make those predictions on what would happen if an oil spill occurs. And if we use various spill response options, how well would they recover? And that's something that we're doing with the Atlantis model with CSRO in Australia, working with the physical oceanographers at UBC, and they're developing a model for the Sailor Sea on the West Coast. So when we look at the MPRI program overall and the way we put it together by focusing on key areas, what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we want to improve Canada's oil spill preparedness and response regime by enhancing science-based evidence for use in decision-making. We want to enhance the public's confidence in our ability to clean up and remediate oil spills in Canada. One of the things that we want to do is to actually commercialize some of the products that we're producing and make sure that they're actually applied by end users. We can't conduct the type of research that we're looking at alone. And if we did, there'd be a lot of overlap. So how do we leverage our research to reduce that duplication of effort between industry, academia, and government? So in our program, we're working very closely, for instance, with the US EPA, with NOAA, with BSEE, who's the US regulator for oil spills in the US, SINTEF in Norway, CEDRA in France, Chinese Academy of Sciences. So there's a lot of international collaboration and leverage, especially for things like the field trials, where we're looking at field trials with ships that are coming from the Canadian Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard, as well as oil spill response operators in the US and Canada. What we want to do is enhance research capability, quality advice, and coordination of research and advice in Canada. And one of the most important things, I think, is the education of highly qualified personnel in oil spill research for the next generation. And that's the end of my talk. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Daniel, if you could pop up our next slide here. Thank you.
I have a quick question before we move forward. Actually, I would really, because thank you very much for that. And it really gives us a very good view of how a problem specifically related to pollution remediation is being addressed and what the outcomes could be. And I'm curious in terms of some of the other pollutants, like, so oil is kind of like the upstream plastic, you know, and there's a bit of a, like, they're kind of two sides of a coin. And then there's also in terms of going forward with oil and the trends in the planet. So that's my one. Is there ways we can learn from one another from an actual physical perspective, like you were saying, oil spill versus a plastic spill, very different and yet similar in dispersion. So question one. And then number two is where oil is, where we're looking at oil and then the trends that we're seeing globally, do we think that, or do you think that some of these oil spill issues will decrease, not necessarily in severity, but in quantity as we're looking at more renewables and getting off oil and the like, or do you think that that is just not going to happen?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that although people look at, renewable energy sources and things like ocean renewable energy, which we also have programs on and look at impacts of that. One of the things you have to realize is due to energy demand globally, we'll still be using oil or petroleum derivatives probably the next 30 years. And yes, the number of oil spills is going down globally from things like oil spills from tankers, as I mentioned, because of new safety measures. But at the same time, the risk is going up because now we're drilling for oil offshore in deeper waters, and the risk of oil spills has changed because of shipping. So now we're looking at shipping, in the Arctic, it's increasing. In the future, you're going to be seeing things like ecotourism in the Arctic, large vessels going through. And of course, in those areas, you're looking at very remote sites where it's very difficult to get to. So there are new challenges up in the areas like that, oil spill remediation, and hence the focus on techniques that are in situ, like natural attenuation. At the same time, as we all know, Canada is producing diluted bitumen, and who's our largest customer that we're looking at? It's China. So we have this new risk of potential oil spills on the west coast of Canada from transshipment of diluted bitumen to China. And of course, that product behaves differently from conventional crude oils. So there's a lot of concerns about that. So the challenges are still there, but the innovation and the science we need has to change with it. So there's that transition. A lot of the techniques that I think that we are developing and using for oil spills could be used for looking at plastics or microplastics. If you look at the work that we're doing on AUVs and trying to detect particles in the water column, for instance, you may be looking for microplastics. We're also looking at, dispersed chemical oil droplets. How do we distinguish between the two? But really, there's a lot of crossover in those technologies. It's understanding where things are, how do we monitor them, how can we recover them? And as I mentioned, you have the same problem with plastics as we have with oil spills. To physically go up and try and recover it, it's a huge challenge. It just isn't there using conventional technologies. A lot of people look at the Gulf of Mexico and you see these images of all those boats out there with booms and skimmers capturing oil. They captured between 4 to 5% of the oil in the most ideal conditions. Most of the oil in the Gulf of Mexico actually degraded. And because of genomics, we now know that a lot of the oil, even at depth, degraded. People thought, well, Gulf of Mexico is warm. Of course, the oil is going to degrade quickly. But even at 1,000 meters depth, the oil down there degraded relatively quickly. So genomics has changed that story altogether. So there's a lot of advances in science that we can build on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Matt Search had a question.
Thanks. So Ken, you mentioned earlier the risk envelope, especially in the context of the Arctic, in terms of increased activity and extraction and potential spills. So can you kind of characterize for folks the vectors of the spills that actually are most concerning? So in the context of like actual regulation around hulls, for example, so like double hulls are now the requirement for tankers carrying oil, as far as I know. So where is the actual predominant risk? Where does that lie when it comes to moving around, transmitting, refueling, the whole sort of gamut?
Well, I think in terms of risk, that isn't something that I'm working on directly in the Arctic. And as I mentioned, because of things like double hulls, the safety factor is increased for tanker spills. Now, one of the things that you have to realize is, although people think that, gee, we're getting more open water in the Arctic, we still have a big challenge, and that is multi-year sea ice. So the risk in the Arctic is, even though there may be more open waters, that multi-year sea ice is still a major challenge. The other thing in the Arctic is really distances for oil spill recovery. You're looking at spills that would occur in remote areas, and it's not something that you can get a lot of people to very quickly to respond to. It would take a long time to get to them. So that's a challenge. There's a lot of growth in industry in the Arctic, such as mining. And so these sites where industry is growing, they're bringing in larger ships to bring fuel into these areas. One of the big challenges of oil spills in the Arctic, where they're looking at drilling oil in the Arctic, which is right now there's a moratorium that could open up in the future, is really understanding where oil is moving in the Arctic. If we had a spill and winter came on, and now that oil slick is under ice. So understanding where is that slick moving under ice. So technologies for detection of oil under ice, and how do we track that oil and where will it surface later on, is a major challenge. And of course, there's obviously the biological effects, because the most productive area in the Arctic is that zone directly under ice. So those are some of the challenges that are there still in the Arctic. There are major challenges.
Yeah, thanks. I would just, based on what you were just saying, a follow-up question would be, are there any sort of tech development areas that you're interested in on the sensing side? This is something that my team in particular would be interested in.
Can you just repeat that question again?
Yeah, so in what areas would you be happy to see folks digging into developmentally with regard to sensing technology? So you mentioned ice oil undersea ice and tracking that. So there are various means that one could imagine you could track that. Where do you see developmental opportunities in that particular case?
Oh, there's, so you're saying like what technologies will you develop if we're looking at oil under ice?
Yeah.
There's a number of technologies that are being developed. Some of the things that you're looking at is, for instance, the MUN AUV that I showed the pictures of. The Explorer AUV was actually developed in part to use under ice. So one of the big technology developments actually is sensor technologies for detection of oil, and trying to validate which are the best sensors for use for tracking oil spills. The other major challenge is tracking physically and chemically dispersed oil. So if you're looking at detection and tracking, one of the areas that we would look at in the Arctic is potentially the use of chemical oil dispersants, and how do you track the efficiency of the use of chemical dispersants. So you want to differentiate between physically dispersed oil droplets and those that are chemically dispersed. And that would largely be by particle sizes, as well as fluorescence signals and things like that.
Okay, I'm going to jump in there because we've got some more work to do here, but thank you both. So Daniel, back to the slide.